Well, I have no songs for this week, to everyone's relief. What I do have is everybody's favorite Abraham Kuyper quote. There is not one square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. Isn't that beautiful? I want to ask a question about it, though. To what extent should we claim things in his name? He is the Lord. He's the sovereign one. There's not one square inch over the whole human existence over which he does not say, mine. He's the anointed one. We are little anointed ones. It's his mission that's been bequeathed to us. Do we claim things for him and say, this belongs to King Jesus? Surely, a statement like that, when I think about how it applies to my life, has to include the idea of personal surrender. There's a sense in which it's a devotional statement. We read it, I recite it, some of you quoted along with it, you've heard it before. And it's a challenge to us. As followers of Jesus, will we surrender to him what is rightfully his? But can we go a little bit wider than just personal piety? I think it should inform our witness. Isn't that in some sense what we're doing? He says, go out and make disciples of the nations. Right? So I'm a follower of Jesus, but I'm there to teach the nations to obey him. That's what Matthew 28 says. So there's an evangelistic sense in which I should think about that statement. And while we're at it, I think there's a kind of gospel optimism. If that's true, there's great refuge in that. It's up to him. He's going to claim it all. Can I then enforce this on others, though? It gets a little bit more complicated the further out from the self you go. So, can I enforce it in my family? Well, by God's grace, I will enforce it in my family. It belongs to him. Lord, have it all. Easier said than done. But it's the right thing to do, right? It's the right posture, and no one really is going to dispute that. What about my family? Can I claim my family for Jesus? Can I say, by God's design, I'm the head of this household, and we will run things the way Jesus has told us to do it? Yeah, I think so. You can say, as long as I'm running the show, right, we're going to live by my rules, but they're not really my rules. They're the rules of my king. Can I enforce that in my home? I think so. I think I have a duty, in fact. What about my church? Now, I know this wouldn't fly very well, but let's think about the 2,000 years of church history. Which was generally true? Did people look at their pastor as an authority figure or their friend? Doesn't the Bible, I'm thinking like Hebrews 13, 1 Peter 5, Acts 20, 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1. Don't these passages sort of lay out a design from God where the elders of a local church actually have authority over the sheep? And so isn't there some sense that I have a God-given duty and a responsibility that I will answer to for whether or not I ran the church according to the dictates of my king? All I am is a steward while I await his return. And he's going to come back one day, and he's going to say, Prince, what have you been doing with my kingdom while I was gone? What if we keep going? What about my local neighborhood? Can I enforce it in some way? What about my city, my state? What about my country? Can I enforce this Abraham Kuyper statement on the nations? Ought I? And how should I interact with people when I encounter them, whether they're personal or, let's say, high-profile people, famous people, leaders even? How should I think? How should I interact with or respond when I encounter these people that I know will not bow the knee to Christ? Sit on my hands and move on? Or do I have a duty here? I alluded to this last week. Consider for a moment the two people that we will be asked to vote between in 13 days. One, Donald Trump, famously in 2016, before he was actually the nominee, so there were like 17 other options at the time if you were a Republican. He was asked by people who were thinking like me, like Christians, like, you kind of have a past, doesn't really seem to jive with our movement, so to speak. So tell me, Mr. Trump, have you ever repented? You know the answer, right? Well, of course not. Why would I repent? I don't need to. I just try to be a good person. That is someone that's not going to bow the knee to Jesus. You understand? Whatever some mega super pastor down in Texas has to say, from the horse's mouth, I will not repent. I will not bend the knee to King Jesus. But the alternative? Did you hear what happened this week? Vice President Kamala Harris is at a rally, and someone in the room cries out, "Jesus is Lord!" Right? Light in the darkness. What did she say immediately? "You're at the wrong rally." And thunderous applause. And in her cackling way, she just savored the moment. She won that moment. That was her viral spiking of the football, where she said, "This place, we will not say Jesus is Lord." So in 13 days, we will choose which path of ruin we prefer. I'm just going to level with you here for a minute. I'm not actually a prophet, so I have no authority behind what I'm going to say, but in my most cynical moments, I think this could be it. I'm not convinced that either side is prepared to accept defeat in 13 days, no matter what happens. These are the makings of a civil war. And I don't know what that looks like, because you can't just draw a line across the country. It might be male-female. It might be the educated elite and us rural hicks. It might be the city versus the country people. Right? I don't know exactly how it's going to work out, but we're headed for it. We need some options, don't we? What are we going to do? It's about to go from bad to worse, in my view. So last week we looked at one of those options, the Benedict option. It's the options that's sort of described in this graph, if you will, on the right. It's the way of the Lamb. And it's modeled by Jesus. And the whole idea is that what we need to do is maybe there's a form of responsible withdrawal where we opt out of the chaos and the nonsense and the insanity, and we build intentional communities that deliberately contrast the ways of the world. And in doing so, we use our lives, we lay them down in community in such a way that shows the world a better way. And the idea is, when it all comes crumbling down, we'll have the skills, we'll have the community to maybe start putting it back together. It's called the Benedict option. There are some liabilities, though, to that. We need more than just that option. Here's one. And we should just admit it. The Benedict option is very attractive to what we might call you've heard this, the 11th commandment Christians. Do you know what 11th commandment Christians are? So you know the 10, right? Well, the 11th commandment is thou shalt be nice. Right? So when all things 2020 came for us, and we were talking about go from overreach, and we were talking about wear the mask, and if you don't love your neighbor. When we were talking about racial issues and just all the stuff that was coming up, there was this kind of a mantra, we should just get along and love everybody, and just basically 1960s hippie language in the church. The 11th commandment, thou shalt be nice. But what about confronting the lies? What about confronting the doctrines that are actually inflaming the issues, not solving them? These are godless ideologies, and we're just going to be nice? Don't we have a duty to demolish, to tear them down, to speak truth to these lies? So there's no question that this option here on the right, the Benedict option, it's attractive to these people because it's nice. There's pleasant. It's sort of a, kind of like a heaven on earth. Like, man, that's crazy, man. We'll just go out here and we'll just do our little thing. So just because it attracts some people that aren't thinking correctly, though, doesn't mean the whole thing is bunk. But we need to admit it. It's going to appeal to those people. It just is. Although I think that sometimes strategies fail not because the strategy is flawed, but because people are flawed. And that's what we're talking about here. But another liability is that there's no guarantee of success. Right? It's sort of like you said, right? It leans into the providence of God. The idea is we're going to be faithful. We're going to represent our King as best we can and trust the results to the Lord. Which, by the way, is what Jesus did in 1 Peter 2. He entrusted himself to one who judges justly. Didn't even speak a word. Right? That's the way of the Lamb. But we'd like to have some sort of guarantee of success. And so I think basically it's a simple liability. We use it in finance. Diversify. Right? This strategy might not work. So if there are other strategies that we can employ, let's include them, right? Let's spread the wealth. Let's spread our investment. And it's sort of similar to the first thing I said, but I think that the Benedict option might end up providing cover for Christians who have come to believe what the secularists have been telling them for years, that they have no place in politics. This is the easy way out. This is when Christians leave the room because they've been bullied out. And they actually tell themselves that they were right. This isn't my place. We don't belong in politics. And this might be the attractive option for people who are thinking like that way. So I think it's a good option. I think we need to employ the option. It's a good strategy, but we need to know there are some liabilities, and we're going to collect some people who are not thinking rightly about some of these things. Eric Metaxas, he was talking about the parable of the talents, and he talked about how some people will give religious reasons for doing the wrong things. The Benedict option could very well be that for some people. Right? How do I uphold the lies of the state? By telling you that if you don't love your neighbor. So, this is a problem that was articulated and combated faithfully, effectively, in my view, by a more recent man of Issachar, one who understands the times and knows what to do about it, the late, great Francis Schaeffer. He profoundly influenced me. I began to read his work when I was in high school. So I was reading things that he had written in the 70s, in the 80s. He passed away when I was a baby. I've gone back over the years and I've listened to some of his teachings, and I remember about maybe 12-ish years ago, I pulled up one of his last messages, so it's early 80s, and it's about apologetics and worldview and stuff that a lot of people, I get it. And I just start weeping because at the time it had been about 40 years. And I was just like, this is prophecy. And it just landed on me so heavily. It was insane to me how well he nailed it. He understood the times and cast a vision for what we're to do about it. So in his book, The Christian Manifesto, he talks about this a bit. And he diagnoses a problem. He says there's been a fundamental shift. So this is in the wake of Roe v. Wade. For us, it's been over 50 years. In him, it was like in near hindsight, 10, 15 years. Not that far in the rearview mirror. But he says we're not dealing with a 15-year-old problem. It's an 80-year problem. There's been a shift. There's been a shift from a Judeo-Christian consensus to a humanistic consensus. And so the secularists were putting out works like the Communist Manifesto and the Humanist Manifesto, hence the title of his book, The Christian Manifesto. And fundamentally what had happened is the Judeo-Christian worldview had been replaced by what's called philosophical materialism. In other words, all there is stuff. Simple enough, simpler way to think about it. That the cosmos should be understood as material, energy, time, and that's it. Well, what do you end up with? What are the consequences of that worldview? And he just went and he exposed what had been happening and was going to continue to happen. That if you do that, man himself becomes the measure of all things. I mean, if not men, is it going to be deer? So you get rid of God, and so you must inevitably put man in his place in some way. And if this philosophical materialism is the final reality, the nature of things at bottom, at end, man must be the measure of all things, and he himself will be the generator of meaning. That is, it will be up to individuals to say, this is what meaning is. I don't discover what is true, I decide what is true. You know, speak your truth. It's grounded in this worldview. And so what you're going to end up with is a society that's basically like a bunch of little toddlers running around saying, mine, mine, that's not fair. You know, I want what I want, how I want, when I want. And there's no one who can say, but your affections are disordered. You can't point to something outside and say, you must follow, you must adhere, you must submit. And, thinking of politics, he articulated pretty convincingly that this shift in worldview, what had happened is that was the worldview of our founding fathers. And so when society at large decided to get rid of God and put man in its place, they were going to inevitably do the same thing with the Constitution. It was just inevitable. So if you resist God, the same principle is at work in politics. I have this 250-year-old document, but it doesn't really mean anything. It means what we say it means. So if we loose ourselves from God, we will loose ourselves from the Constitution. Think about how this impacts the issue of abortion, one that's near and dear to even those of us who, well, just regardless, most Bible-believing Christians, regardless of how they vote, they still care a lot about this issue, generally speaking. Although, sadly, there's been some very odd shifts in that lately. But think about the logic behind this issue. And we talked about this a little bit last week. One of our failures is that we were only thinking about what we're talking about today, the Boniface option, which is how do we change it? How do we bring down the power of the state to change the laws? We were so concerned with how to do that, how to do the Boniface option, that we didn't do the Benedict option, which emphasizes words and the truth claims and the lives we live. And so instead of making abortion illegal, we failed to make abortion unthinkable. And that was the victory we really needed. We needed to change people's hearts and minds, and we utterly failed. But the logic here is, well, why is this institutionalized murder, which is what it is? Why is this institutionalized child sacrifice, which is what it is, okay? And not just okay, but celebrated. We used to say safe, legal, and rare. Now we say shout it out. How did that happen? Well, because the logic is that the final reality is stuff. And so I am the authority. And so what's it really about at bottom? Personal happiness. That's why the scourge of abortion runs all over our land. The cult of happiness. I want to go to work and make money. I don't have time to be a mom. Or a dad. I want to spread my seed as far and wide as possible and not have to pony up and be responsible to take care of the offspring I produce. I want the pleasure. I want happiness. And it really has become the fundamental doctrine of today's radical left. It's the thing, it's the one ring that holds it all together. It's this issue. They've even co-opted our religious language to defend it. You know what I'm saying? 2 ordinances that we practice regularly, baptism and the Lord's Supper. What did Jesus say when he first instituted the Lord's Supper? This is my body broken for you. What's the mantra of pro-choice? My body, my choice. I will break that body for me. Complete occultic subversion of the gospel itself. Francis Schaeffer talked about true spirituality, which is the idea that Jesus is Lord not just of your religious life, but of all things. And what that means is that if we're going to have revival, revival is going to manifest itself in real change in your personal life, but also, yes, social and political. And he acknowledges that what we're talking about here is not that we want to try to bring a theocratic kingdom on earth. We're not trying to do that, but he does say this, and I have a quote here. He says, we're asking for one thing, that freedom that was provided for us in the First Amendment, that we actually are allowed to use it as Christians. And he's saying this in the late 70s and early 80s, feeling like Christians were being sidelined. That's gotten worse since then, not better. Like, I'm not trying to institutionalize Christianity. I just want my right that you would recognize, that you acknowledge, I want to be able to use it unfettered. When a government commands that which is contrary to the law of God, it abrogates its authority, he says. At a certain point, it is not only the privilege, but the duty of the Christian to disobey the government. So now we're getting, this is challenging. We're going to start talking about civil disobedience. Right, but what about Romans 13? Right? In other words, what about the most popular passage of 1930s Germany? That's what Nazi propagandists trained the pastorate to preach about, to shut up the church. Right? How do you use religious lingo to defend your wrongdoing? Let's hear. But we have an example of this civil disobedience in the Bible. A famous one is in Acts 5. The apostles were commanded by the local rulers, you got to stop talking about Jesus. What do they say in chapter 5? We'll honor you the best we can, but you need to be very clear on something. If we have a choice between obeying you and God, we must obey God rather than men. And I think we should keep in mind, we have this very unfortunate, kind of glorious, or I should say, almost sentimentalized view of the martyrs that have gone before us. We uphold them, we esteem them, as we should. But you have to understand that while we do that in memory of them, when it happened, that wasn't the way it worked. There wasn't like a crowd of people praising them for their valor and their courage. They were persecuted as enemies of the state. They had no friends on those days. They didn't have the support of a community behind them in most cases. Anyone that gave them support was with them in the fire. So most of the martyrs down through the ages, those that shed their blood for the cause of Christ, went down in history at that time as enemies, as chaos agents. Francis Schaeffer says, the bottom line is that if there is no place for disobeying the government has been put in the place of the living God. In such case, the government has been made a false god. Now think about that Abraham Kuyper quote now. There is not one part of human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. And Francis Schaeffer is accurate. What he's saying is when the government says, you must obey no matter what they're saying is, we're God. You think about how incredibly rebellious a statement that is. The God who gave them their authority. They're saying, no. It's mine, not yours. Doug Gruteis had a great 2-sentence summary of his book. I'll just read it to you and then we'll move on. He says, conservative Christians draw on the philosophy of the American founding and the development of its principles over time. This philosophy grounds rights in the character of God, limits the power of the state through separation of powers, and grants all citizens fair participation in civil life. Christian citizens of the United States have just as much right to bring their moral vision into politics as does any other citizen. A Christian Manifesto, Francis Schaeffer's best-selling 1981 book, made this case convincingly and urgently in light of the challenges to religious freedom that have increased since its publication. 1981. Just incredible to me. He nailed it. So we need people to execute the Benedict option. We need people to set up intentional communities that show the world a better way. But we might need more than that. Because we also need to combat the spirit of the age. We need to go to war. We need to confront the evil that we are born into. This worldview shift that Francis Schaeffer talks about is at a point where it really does pose an existential threat to the church, although we trust the church will never be snuffed out entirely, to our nation. I sound so cynical. Sometimes I think we're not making it to 250. At least not in any way that resembles what it is or has been. But even the world. And so for that reason, we need the Boniface option. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the Boniface story, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. So the Benedict story began around 500 AD as the Roman Empire was falling. And this story takes place about 200 years later. It's around early 700s AD. And Boniface was actually, interestingly enough, a Benedictine monk. So there is no Boniface if there was no Benedict, you see. He is the fruit of the Boniface option, or of the Benedict option. And so here he is, he's at the monastery, and he's about to get a promotion, right? He's going to be the abbot, I think they call it. I don't know my Catholic hierarchies very well, but he's going to be like the guy that runs the monastery. And he says, nope, God's called me somewhere else. He's called me out there. The wild, untamed, deeply pagan Germania. And after a little while, he secured the blessing of the Pope. And he was given a rank, now a bishop. Interesting thing though, he's a bishop without a diocese. Because where he's going, there's no kingdom of Christ Jesus there. But he says, that's where I'm going. Now, he's going around, he's trying to figure out how to do this ministry. How am I going to reach these lost pagan people? And he comes across a tree, and it turns out this tree is highly revered. It's called the Donar oak. It had become an idol. This tree represented one of their deities by the name of Donar. Now, you probably don't know ancient Germanic paganism very well, but you probably know a little bit about Roman. So Donar is the Roman equivalent Jupiter, or the Norse, you'll know this one, Thor. Right? He is the beloved son of the supreme deity. So this Thor oak, we might say, represents the god of these people that they worship, and they're not to touch it. And Boniface is like, your God's got nothing on me. He's got nothing on my God. I'm chopping down that tree. He gets the word out because he wants a scene. It's almost reminiscent of like Elijah and the prophets of Baal. He wants them all there. They gather the next day, midday, he touches it. Nothing happens. Because they say that when you do that, his lightning is going to come down and destroy you. He takes his axe, he swings it, hits it one time, and then the wind blows and fells the tree. And the pagans, who up to now have believed that this tree represented, Thor, see that this Boniface's God brought a wind, felled the mighty tree. They place their faith in his God, and they convert. And then they chop it down, and they use the wood to build the first church in Germania. How cool is that? He went on to expand the kingdom, plant more churches, expand the church. He would baptize many pagans in his life. His life came to sort of an unceremonious end when he was just accosted by some bandits on the side of the road, and he was killed by these armed robbers. And that's sort of the end of his story. There's one more little detail about it that I'll share with you at the end. But that's the Boniface story. So now I want to talk to you about the Boniface Option. Now, there was a book, and I talked to you about it last week, called The Benedict Option, which was written by Rod Dreher, came out in 2016-17. And Andrew Isker is his name. He wrote this book called The Boniface Option because he thought the Benedict Option was lacking in some things. I want to tell you a little bit about his book. I'm not really going to go through it like I did last week, but I just want to tell you a few things about it. First thing I want to say, it's not too long. It's like 160 pages. Fairly small, I forgot to bring it, but it's not that hard of a read. And I would say that with this book, the form is just important as the content. Let me describe the form. It's irreverent and sarcastic and biting and witty. And what I'm saying is, there's a time and a place for that, right? So we have this social archetype, the jester, right? It's what comedians are. They fulfill this social archetype, right? They call out the absurdities of modern life by making fun of them, by mocking them in a fun way. And Andrew Isker is pretty irreverent, funny, and kind of has a very mocking tone. And you know what? Frankly, some things should be mocked. I mean, his opening line is, "You live in trash world." And you could just list one thing after the other. The insane places that we've gone to as a society, they are mockable. And I think maybe the 11th Commandment Christians who will hate this book maybe actually need to work through it a little bit and get a little bit of an acid tongue. So it also makes it easy to read, seriously. I think you might enjoy the process of reading this book, and I'm happy to recommend it if you'd like to do that. It's not a hard read. It's funny. Every now and then, you'll be deeply offended by it. It's one of those books, right? But it's like, think of like Bill Maher. Like Bill Maher, right? Like in the early 2000s, y'all probably hated that dude, right? When he was talking about, well, it doesn't matter, but going against everything that you as a Bible-believing Christian probably believe in. And then all of a sudden, we got to Trash World, and he started making sense about some of this stuff. And you're like, man, that Bill Maher, he's pretty sensible. And he's got that acid-tongued, witty, sarcastic way about him that performs a necessary social duty, exposing the absurdities of our world. And so, depending on what he's writing about in this book, you might not like it. I mean, he even goes after seed oils and processed ingredients in our diets and how they're making us crazy, which I'm heavily inclined to agree with. But some of you will not like that. Because you're like, maybe I should put aside this cheeseburger and fries, you know? So, but he writes about it in a really funny way. So anyways, the form is just as important as the content. And I actually think there's a place for that. I think it illustrates the content. This is wartime. It's time to fight. No, this isn't a time to be nice. So he sets up the book in two parts. I won't go through them, but basically the first one it illustrates the story. The first one is chopping down the tree. And the idea is, what are our idols? What are the oaks of our culture that need to be chopped down? And that's what he does. He just goes through and systematically chops down all the idols of our modern day in a very irreverent, kind of witty, funny, sometimes nasty. No, nasty's too strong, but, you know, biting way. But then the second part is, just like the story, now we're going to build Christendom with the remains of what we just tore down. Right? It's pretty aggressive, and I actually like it. I'm going to sound like a toxic male here pretty soon. We'll talk about a few other, I'll say, Boniface ideas that sort of are in the general spirit of what we're calling the way of subversion, the way of the lion, confronting the spirit of the age. Eric Metaxas, again, in his book, Letters to the American Church, he said, like many before him have said, and I wholeheartedly agree, the church historically has played a role of being the conscience of the state. And this is important. We can't be the conscience of the state if we aren't actually speaking. And we must do this. You know, yes, it can get really weird when we talk about, should we enter into the state? Should the church become the state? Well, regardless of how we sort that out, we must, at bottom, at minimum, be the conscience of the state. And we must speak to do that. That's a very Boniface sort of confrontational way. Mere Christendom is a book by Doug Wilson, who very similar, in fact, I believe he privately discipled Andrew Isker. So you can sort of see where he gets his wit from. Doug Wilson, brother in the Lord. I love him sometimes. Other times it's like, oh, come on. You know, like he's that guy, right? But we need Doug Wilsons in the world. And, but his books make some good points. He says, you know what? There's no such thing as what we call a naked public square, right? This idea that you can be neutral. It doesn't exist. If we try to create a neutral public square, something will fill the void. And it's either going to be the living God or a witless idol, right? It's either going to surrender to Christ who says of everything mine, or it will be like that oak tree. To four. You know, in his very Doug Wilson-y way, he talked about the Salem witch trials. You know, this is like this, it's one of those things. It's that in the Crusades, right? To talk about how bad Christians were in history. He's like, yeah, it's like 25 people that were killed in the Salem witch trials. That's bad. Can it even be compared to the 3,000 murders that occur every single day in the wombs of our happiness-seeking women and men? And so his comment on it was, what are you embracing for the sake of what you are avoiding? What are you embracing for the sake of what you are avoiding? In other words, we want to be nice. We want to avoid confrontation. We want to avoid the fight. We just want to get along with everyone because I want to preserve my Christian witness. But the challenge here is, just so that people don't like you, just so that people don't throw you in the Christian nationalist camp, just so people don't say, this is crusade talk, this is Salem witch trials, what are you giving up? Truth, in many cases. Courage. And how problems get worse over time when we are silent. And then here's another Boniface idea. You ever read The Great Commission? And Jesus even recognizes at the beginning of it, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. And he sends his disciples out into the world to fix the people in their community. No, I don't think that's what he said. He sent them to make disciples of the nations, teaching them to obey everything that he had commanded. That's pretty aggressive. Now let's talk about some liabilities of the Boniface option. Take a drink. I have to mention this one because it's near and dear to my heart, and I mentioned his book already twice, Eric Metaxas, in his book, Letters to the American Church. I liked a lot of what he wrote. I think a lot of Christians need to read that book. But he makes a couple of grievous errors in that book. I just want to mention a couple. One is his absolute butchery of James 2. James 2 is the passage where there's this dialogue, in with the way James is writing, and it's about the tension between faith and works, right? What Eric Metaxas does is he does what many pastors do today who believe what's called lordship salvation. And he turns James 2 into a works-based test of genuine salvation. That is to say, he believes and says very forcefully, if you do not do, you are not a Christian. Your standing before Jesus is not the one that was imputed to you by his grace through faith. You don't have it. The problem with this interpretation of James 2 is many, but one, James himself makes it very clear that the justification involved in James 2 is this direction. Okay, when we're talking about salvation, justification to God, Paul makes very clear we're not justified by works of the law, but by God's grace through faith. But guess how we're justified this way? Works. So if I say to you, I'm a Christian, and you say, show me the evidence, and there is none, do I have an argument? No, I don't. And that's what James is talking about. In the courts of men, works prove our claims. In the courts of God, it is Christ's blood and blood alone that we plead for righteousness. Okay? So I appreciate what Eric Metaxas is trying to do, but I can't accept that. And this is very common, and I, as a pastor, when I hear a lot of pastors that I know and respect, they have this take. It's, like I said, it's called lordship salvation. I bristle every time I hear it because I think they nurture doubt in genuine believers. They even go on, that it can get very dark. They question, does God really love me? And they end up trying to test the genuineness of their own beliefs by their works, which makes, you understand that the path of Christian maturity is not learning to look at yourself, it's learning to look more at Jesus. So this lordship salvation is teaching the follower of Jesus to inspect yourself when you need to just look up at Jesus. So I've got a lot of problems with that, and I can't not address it. And I find that very works-oriented take is very common amongst these Boniface types, I'll say. Also in this book, he talks about a concept called the spiral of silence, which is important. The idea here is, if you don't speak up, courage inspires courage, cowardice inspires cowardice. That's true. But I think he takes this concept and he makes too much out of it, and he basically uses to sort of inflame people, like you can't ever, ever, ever not speak up. You must confront, you must stand, you must, be the bullhorn at the street corner kind of a thing. And here's the thing, Jesus sometimes was silent. Sometimes we actually are to let our actions speak for us. Moses had an instance where he recognized that God will speak for me. And this isn't the model for every situation. I'm not rejecting the reality that courage inspires courage and cowardice inspires cowardice. But we can make too much of this principle, and I've seen this at work many times. And what happens is we get unsophisticated, unintelligent, not thoughtful, just loud, belligerent, preaching nonsense. In other words, posting memes on Facebook. And I actually think this is a problem. I talked about this weeks ago. I see it as a virtue to know how to change your mind when better evidence comes. But you know what happens when you say, oh no, spiral of silence, I must speak. We speak before we understand. And the more you invest emotionally and socially, you put it out there for everyone to see, you make it your identity, you make it a signal of your virtue, what are the chances that when evidence comes, you will change your view? Because you have just raised the personal stakes to a degree that you are rarely willing to pay. Right? So there's a carefulness of thought and understanding that I think must precede our words. And this idea of spiral of silence, I think, can sometimes inflame that, and we get the order wrong. Well, I'll move on from that. I want to talk about another trait. It's really interesting that you'll see in this camp. So, when we talk about eschatology, end times, how many of you are familiar with the term premillennial? Okay? So there's premillennial, there's amillennial, and there's postmillennial. These are the three primary views. So, Revelation 20 talks about this millennial reign of Christ. It lasts 1,000 years. That's why we call it the millennial reign. There are three, all like within the pale of Christian orthodoxy, so none of these views are heretical, but they can't all be true. So it's one of those kinds of things. The premillennial view is that Jesus is the second coming is going to happen in the future, and he's going to set up a 1,000 literal year reign that is 1,000 times around the sun. And at the end of that, Satan will be loosed from prison. There'll be a little season of rebellion, and then there'll be the final battle and the final judgment and all that. Okay, that's the premillennial view. The amillennial view sort of spiritualized this period and just says, well, it's a really long period of time, and generally says we're in the millennium in some sense. So you hear me talk a lot about the already but not yet tension. Right? They love this term. They may have even invented it for all I know. Right? We're in it, but there's a deeper coming of it later. But then there's post-millennialism. And it's similar to amillennialism in that it sort of spiritualizes the term, but there's one key difference. It places the return of Christ at the end of the millennium, not before, and says that Christ's return is contingent on our successful transformation of the world into the kingdom. And then once we've prepared it for him, he'll come and receive it. Right? So this is postmillennialism. Now, I bet your favorite preachers are postmillennial. Vodi Bakum, R.C. Sproul. I could go on, right? Great guys. Men of God, great preachers. A lot of people that really get involved in politics, Christians who are involved in politics, it's incredible how often they're post-millennial. And you can sort of see how the profile works, right? If you're post-millennial, you believe the return of Christ is contingent on you changing the world. So if we don't fix the world, Jesus doesn't come back. So it motivates you, doesn't it? And in fact, I've said this, I'm premillennial. I've said I'm premillennial, but I like to preach with a postmillennial spirit. Right? Because there's something about the postmillennialists I love. Because they're saying, you gotta go, you gotta work, you gotta spread the gospel, we gotta change the world. Spread the fragrance of Christ everywhere. I love that. Jonathan Edwards, The Great Awakening, it was a postmillennial theology that literally brought revival to our country. Yeah. It happened. Theology changed our country. But, did you hear that one coming? A lot of people in this post-millennial stream, they go to the next level and they embrace something called theonomy, God's law. And they really do begin to articulate a vision of Christians taking over the world. And they're not heretics, but you can see how that might create some struggles and maybe some problems. Now, I sometimes enjoy listening to these people debate. Sometimes I hate it. You know how debates go. So one way I've heard postmillennialists talk about their their view and why it's worth believing. And this is, when you can pack a punch in a short sentence, a postmillennialist will say, we believe that the Great Commission will be successful. Premillennials, say John MacArthur, he's actually famous for saying this, we lose down here. Do you see the difference? John MacArthur, premillennial, we lose down here. Right? Vodi Bakum, postmillennial, the Great Commission will be successful. One's pretty pessimistic, the other one's pretty optimistic. I love them both. And you can see how if you're of the MacArthur persuasion, you almost glorify martyrdom. Right? We lose down here. So what's the best thing I can accomplish? To die for Christ. But if you're postmillennial, we win down here. And so what's the best thing you can do? Chop down a tree and build a church in its place. I don't know about you. I think we need MacArthur's and Bokums. I think we need Benedict's and Boniface's. The authors of those two books don't like each other. It's sad to me, because I think they're a perfect complement to each other. I heartily recommend both of their books. They will land very differently, and depending on the way you're wired, you might like one and not the other. If you're wired like me, you'll like both. Let's wrap this up. No strategy is perfect, right? And even if we have a perfect strategy, there are no perfect people. And so let's just be honest. There are strengths and weaknesses of both approaches. I believe that Jesus models both, and I've been building that case over the last couple months. Hopefully you've seen that, and I will continue to show it to you. If we get the Benedict option wrong, it's probably because we're thinking it's a nice and easy approach. Right? It's the 11th commandment. Right? The 11th commandment Christians are going to sneak in and just try to turn it into a Christian hippie commune. I get that. That's a problem. Right? But that's not what we're called to. Counting the cost, laying it down, confronting the spirit of the age, it's costly and it ain't easy. So the Benedict option is good, but we must make sure it does not become nice and easy. I think the Boniface option is good. We need courageous, strong, masculine men. I'm going to put you in jail in a few months. I don't know. We need people with courage. We need people who are willing to speak. It's one thing to be willing to say, I won't recant my faith in Jesus, so kill me. But what about in the place of business? When the cost is, you'll probably lose your job. We need people to say, no, I have to fight. I'm chopping down this pagan oak. But the problem is that we think, we like the extreme post-millennialists, we win down here, and we're going to usher in the kingdom. And I think we take it too far sometimes. And the problem with post-millennialism, in my view, is I can't see any justification for making the return of Christ contingent on anything we do. And this is the problem with it, is it tries to accelerate and bring Christ in on our terms. And that's been, in some sense, the problem since the Garden of Eden. So it's not going to be fast and furious. There's one more characteristic, one more detail in the story of Boniface that I think Andrew Isker conveniently left out. I think maybe it's a part of the story he didn't like. I told you how he died, right? On the side of the road, some armed bandits that came. They thought he had all the storage stuff. They thought it was gold. Turned out it was just books. But he lost his life for it. But Boniface had an armed guard with him. He instructed his armed comrades, cease fighting, lay down your arms, for we are told in Scripture not to render evil for evil, but to overcome evil with good. Quoting Romans 12. Funny how he left that one out. You know, that's losing to a post-mill theonomist. The way of the lion and the lamb. They come together at the cross. And this is what I'm going to be talking to you about next week. We're going to talk about the real meaning of Palm Sunday. I've always loved Palm Sunday because there's almost nothing more pleasant to me than to sing the praises of my King. And that story of Jesus coming in, riding on a donkey with the branches and singing, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. I just love it. But you know how Jesus responded to it? He had to retreat from the city. He was grieved. What's that about? We're going to talk about that next week. But what's happening on Palm Sunday is a story. It's Passion Week, and you know where it ends. And what I hope to show you next week is how the cross, on the cross, the way of the lamb and the way of the lion meet. 1 Peter describes it as the way of the lamb. Paul in Colossians 2 describes it as the way of the lion. Until then, I'll leave you with this. There is a time to fight. And it takes great discernment to know when that time is. You'll recall I showed you that even in Ezra and Nehemiah, we have a contrast. Like in a couple of very specific ways. Ezra is going to be your Benedict guy. Nehemiah is your Boniface guy. And we've been going through Ezra and Nehemiah, so you know this. Doesn't happen fast, does it? So this is the path. So, yes, there's a time to fight. But that doesn't mean we're going to wake up tomorrow and say, that was a good one. That's why we dignify the mundane. That's why we embrace 500-year plans, not 5-year plans. That's why we learn to take up our cross and follow Jesus. Because it's slow, painfully so. But it's steadiness, it's faithfulness that will show the world the way of the lamb and the way of the lion. So I leave you with this. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles, to the officials, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. He's not saying you're going to convert the world at the end of the sword. But we are fighting for something. I will very often talk about that triad of the true, the good, and the beautiful. We need to fight for the truth. We need to fight for what goodness is. We need to fight for what beauty really is. And we can define it. It's not in the eye of the beholder. Some things are ugly. You can read the Boniface Option for some pretty good descriptions of that. I'll leave you with that. Let's pray. Father, we need great wisdom for how to find our way in this crazy world at such a time as this. I wish things were simpler. I wish things were easier. I wish things were faster. But even Jesus, our Lord and Savior, who had all the power in the world, didn't choose the easy way, didn't choose the fast way. He chose the hard way. He chose the way where he would bring in his kingdom by turning a tiny little trickle over many thousands of years into a mighty ocean. So, Father, give us the courage to speak. Give us the strength to stand. Give us the resolve to know when to lay down our rights. Make us faithful followers of Jesus for your glory. And Father, I pray for our leaders. They are on very grave paths of rebellion, and they apparently have our support. It does not bode well for them. It does not bode well for us. So we beg upon the mercy of a just God. We tremble before a just God. And we ask, Lord, that if you would be so kind, that you'd give us more time. That you would show us where those oaks are to chop down. That you give us the words that we don't have, the strength that we don't have. That we'd find each other on the way and that we'd build each other up. Because it can't be me versus the world. We need each other. So, Lord, for your glory and for the continued faithful building up of the church, I pray all these things in Jesus' name.